The first sound I heard was metal crunching like a soda can being crushed. For a moment, my brain refused to believe it came from outside. But then I heard it again, the sickening scrape of steel against steel. My heart dropped into my stomach. I threw my coffee onto the counter, nearly burning my hand, and ran out the front door. There it was. My brand new black Silverado, the truck I'd saved for 5 long years to buy. Its front fender crumpled like foil, the headlight dangling by wires. And behind the wheel of the beige Lexus that had just reversed straight into it was the one person who could turn any sunny day into a storm, Karen Whitmore. President of the HOA. She stepped out like nothing had happened, her designer sunglasses sliding down her nose. "Oh, calm down," she said, waving her hand like she was shooing a fly. "It was in the way. You shouldn't have parked it there." My chest tightened. I had parked it exactly where my driveway ended, perfectly within the HOA's own guidelines. The very rules she used to fine everyone else for even the smallest infractions. The way she looked at me, like my truck was a piece of disposable junk, made my blood run hot. "Karen," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "you just smashed a $50,000 truck that I bought 2 weeks ago." She shrugged. "Well, maybe if you didn't have such an ugly gas guzzler, I wouldn't have to look at it every day." I could feel my hands clenching into fists, but I knew if I yelled, she'd twist it against me. That's how Karen worked. She'd start trouble, then play the victim. I pulled out my phone to take pictures for insurance, but she stepped between me and the damage. "No photos," she snapped like she had any authority over my property. "And don't think about filing a claim. This is private property, and I'll make sure you get cited for parking violations before you get a penny out of me." My jaw tightened so hard it hurt. I knew what she was doing, threatening me with HOA rules to scare me into letting this go. But this was my dream truck, the one I'd worked extra shifts for, skipped vacations for. I wasn't letting this go. The worst part? My sister Rachel was standing on her porch across the street, holding her 2 little boys' hands. She mouthed, "Let it go," her eyes begging me not to escalate. She knew how ugly HOA disputes could get. She'd lived under Karen's rule longer than I had, but something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to be bullied into swallowing this. "Karen," I said slowly, "you have 10 minutes to move your Lexus before I call a tow truck." She smirked, glancing at her watch. "I'm the HOA president. No one tows me." Then she turned, got back in her car, and started walking toward her porch like she had just swatted a fly and the conversation was over. I stood there, breathing hard, staring at the deep silver scratches running down the side of my truck. Memories of long nights and double shifts came flooding back, my hands numb from working construction in the cold. My back aching, counting every saved dollar until I could finally walk into the dealership and buy something new instead of another worn-down used car. This wasn't just about metal and paint. This was about respect, and Karen had taken a sledgehammer to that. I glanced at Rachel again, but this time I didn't see fear in her eyes. I saw something else. A flicker of quiet approval, like maybe she was tired of Karen's reign too. I pulled out my phone and dialed the local towing company. "Yeah," I said, my voice steady now. "I've got an unauthorized vehicle blocking my driveway. Beige Lexus. Send your biggest truck." The guy on the other end chuckled. "Be there in 15. When the tow truck pulled up, its engine rumbling. Like a promise of justice, a few neighbors peeked out from behind curtains. Karen was inside her house, probably sipping coffee, smug in the belief she was untouchable. I waved the driver over and pointed to her car. He grinned. "You sure about this? She's gonna lose her mind." I smiled for the first time that morning. "Yeah, that's the point." The chains clinked as he hooked her car, the metal bite echoing through the quiet neighborhood. Halfway through lifting it, Karen came bursting out of her front door in her robe, hair a mess, screaming, "You can't do this." I'm the HOA president. The driver didn't even flinch. "Lady, your car's blocking a driveway? That's all I need to know." She turned to me, her face red. "This is harassment. I'll have you fined, sued, evicted." I stepped closer, close enough to see the panic starting to replace her arrogance. "Karen," I said softly, "you smashed my truck and called it ugly. This is me returning the favor, same hour." Her voice cracked when the tow truck pulled away with her Lexus. The sound of that engine was the sweetest thing I'd ever. Her neighbors were watching openly now, some smirking, some shaking their heads in disbelief. I didn't care. For once, Karen wasn't the one controlling the narrative. As the truck disappeared around the corner, Karen stood frozen in her driveway, her hands trembling, her eyes burning into me like she wanted to set me on fire. But underneath all that rage, I saw it. Fear. For the first time, she realized. She wasn't untouchable. I turned and walked back into my house, my heart pounding. I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to lick her wounds quietly. She'd come for me, and she'd come hard. But as I stood in my kitchen, staring out at my damaged Silverado, I made myself a promise. Whatever she had planned, I'd be ready. Because this fight had just begun. And this time, I wasn't playing defense. The next morning, I woke up to find a bright yellow paper taped to my front door. The words screamed in bold black letters. HOA, notice of violation, immediate. Action required. My stomach twisted before I even read the rest. Karen had wasted no time. I ripped it off and scanned it. She had listed 5 separate infractions against me. Improper vehicle storage. Unauthorized lawn ornament, my sister's boys' soccer net. Garbage bins, visible. From street noise disturbance, which was laughable, and threatening behavior, toward HOA board member. Each one came with a $250 fine. I almost laughed. It was so petty, so obvious. This wasn't about rules. This was about revenge. She'd stayed up all night combing through the HOA handbook, looking for anything she could use against me. I could. Picture her sitting at her kitchen table with a glass of wine, scribbling down a list of all the ways she could make me miserable. And the worst part, she had the power to do it. I knew plenty of people in the neighborhood who'd gone up against her and lost. Some moved away, others paid fines until they bled money. Karen's game was psychological warfare, and she was. A master at it, Rachel, came over while I was still staring at the paper. She didn't even knock, just walked in holding 2 mugs of coffee. "She's not going to stop," she said before I could even open my mouth. "She'll drag this out until you either give in or move." Her voice was low, like Karen could hear through the walls. "You've got to be smarter than her." I wanted to tell Rachel I wasn't afraid, but my gut said otherwise. Karen had friends on the board. She knew every loophole in the bylaws, and she'd used them all. When I stepped outside, I saw her standing in her driveway with her arms crossed, talking to Mr. Lambert, another board member, and her lapdog. She didn't even try to hide the smug smile when our eyes met. "Morning," she called out sweetly, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Hope you got my letter. We need to keep our neighborhood standards high." Lambert chuckled beside her like they were sharing an inside joke. I wanted to march over there and tell her exactly what I thought, but I knew she'd spin it into aggressive behavior and add another fine to her list. Instead, I decided to play along. For now. "Oh, I got it," I said calmly, forcing a smile. "I'll be sure to take care of it." Her eyes narrowed, like she was trying to figure out what I meant. Then she turned away, but not before I caught that glint in her expression, the kind of satisfaction bullies get when they think they've won by afternoon. I realized she'd taken her war a step further. My internet went out. Then my mail. Delivery didn't show. I found out later she had filed noise complaints with the city, and even called animal control about a dangerous dog on my property, which I didn't even own. Each thing on its own was annoying, but together they felt like someone trying to choke me with invisible hands. The message was clear: leave, or I'll make your life hell. That night, Rachel's husband, Mark, stopped by. He's not the kind of guy who talks much, but when he does, you listen. "I've seen her do this before," he said quietly, leaning against my kitchen counter. "She did it to the Millers, made up violations until they couldn't keep up, forced them to sell. Cheap, then her friend bought the place. I think that's what this is. She wants your property." I froze. That thought hadn't even crossed my mind, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. My lot was bigger than most, my driveway longer, and my house sat on a corner, perfect for someone wanting to upgrade. And suddenly, the smash truck didn't feel random. It felt like the opening move in a takeover. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I'd worked too hard for this house, poured too much of my sweat and time into it. She wasn't going to bully me out like she had the Millers. No, if she wanted a war, I'd give her one, but not the kind she was used to winning. I wasn't going to argue with her or yell in the street. That's what she wanted, a public scene to twist into her victim act. No, I'd hit her where it hurt most. Quietly, legally, and in a way she wouldn't see coming until it was too late. That night, I sat down with my laptop and started digging. I looked up property records, HOA bylaws, complaint histories, even public court cases, and it didn't take long to find cracks in her perfect little empire. Karen wasn't as clean as she pretended to be. She'd been fined by the county twice for unpermitted construction on her own property, something the HOA could technically dissolve her position over if enough members voted. She'd also been late on her property taxes last year. And there was a neighbor 2 streets over who'd sued the HOA for harassment and won. All because of her. I went to bed that night with a plan forming in my head. I wouldn't just fight back. I'd dismantle her power piece by piece until she had nothing left to hide behind. But first, I needed to survive her next wave. The next morning, I got my answer. A tow truck was idling in front of my driveway, and my Silverado was already hooked up. I rushed outside. "What the hell are you doing?" I yelled. The driver shrugged. "HOA request. They said you're in violation for blocking public access." My voice shook. "This is my driveway." He sighed. "Take it up with them. I'm just doing my job." And there she was, Karen, standing across the street with her phone out, recording, smile. She called. "This is what happens when you break the rules." I looked at my damaged truck, at her smirking face, and I knew right then this wasn't just going to be about getting even. This was going to be about destroying her. The tow truck pulled away with my Silverado, leaving an empty driveway that felt like a hole in my chest. My fists were clenched so tight, my nails dug into my palms. Karen kept filming until the truck turned the corner. Then she lowered her phone and gave me a slow, mocking wave. "Bye-bye, gas guzzler," she said with a smirk before turning and walking back into her house like she'd just taken out the trash. I stood there for a long time, my blood humming in my ears. Every part of me wanted to storm over there and yell until she shut up, but I knew that's exactly what she wanted, a clip of me losing it that she could show the board, maybe even the police. She thrived on turning her victims into the villains. Not this time. I went inside, sat at my kitchen table, and pulled out my notebook. I'd been making a list for days, every fine, every violation notice, every petty act she'd pulled since the accident. Now, I flipped to a fresh page and wrote at the top, "Take her power away." Under it, I started outlining the plan. This wasn't just about my truck anymore. This was about ending her reign over this neighborhood once and for all. First, I needed allies. Karen ruled through fear, but I knew I wasn't the only one she'd targeted. People whispered about her, at block parties and over fences, but no one ever stood up because they didn't want to be her next victim. I decided to start with the Millers, the couple who'd sold their home at a suspiciously low price last year. I found their number online and called. At first, they were hesitant, their voices tight like they were afraid she might be listening. But once I explained what she'd done to me, the dam broke. They told me how she'd fined them for unapproved paint color, lawn neglect when their grass was barely an inch too long, even excessive trash when they'd had a single bag by the curb. It all led up to a lawsuit they couldn't afford, and in the end, they sold and left just to escape her. "If you can take her down," Mrs. Miller said, her voice trembling, "do it. No one deserves what she does to people." Next, I went to see the neighbor who'd sued and won, a man named Derek, who lived 2 streets over. He was a big guy with a shaved head and arms like tree trunks, but when I mentioned Karen's name, his jaw tightened. "She's poison," he said. He pulled out a folder and handed it to me. Inside were copies of his court case, proof of her harassment, the lies she'd told, and the settlement he'd received. "If you need me to testify, I will. But be careful. She dig through your life until she finds something to use." By the end of the day, I had a list of 7 neighbors, past and present, who were willing to talk. Some gave me photos of violations. Others handed me letters she'd sent, dripping with condescension and threats. Piece by piece, I was building a case that could strip her of her presidency and maybe even dissolve her seat on the board entirely. But Karen wasn't slowing down. That evening, I got a knock on my door, 2 sheriff's deputies standing there with a complaint in hand. "We've had a report of a verbal threat made against a member of the HOA," one of them said. My stomach sank. "That's a lie," I told them. One of the deputies, a younger guy, looked almost apologetic. "We hear that a lot, but we have to follow up." Karen had filed a false police report, claiming I'd told her I would destroy her and her property. I kept my cool, gave them my statement, and made sure they wrote down that she had no witnesses. After they left, I sat in the quiet of my living room, the weight of it pressing on my chest. This woman wasn't just playing dirty. She was playing dangerous. She was trying to set me up for an arrest, something she could wave around as proof that I was the problem. That night, Rachel came over again. She'd heard about the deputies from Mark, and she was furious. "She's going to keep pushing until she breaks you," she said, pacing my living room. "You can't just defend yourself. You have to hit her so hard she can't get back up." I told her about my plan, the neighbors I'd spoken to, the evidence I was gathering. For the first time, I saw hope in her eyes. "If you can get enough people to vote her out, she's done," she said. "But you'll have to be careful. She'll try to smear you before the meeting." I already knew that, and I was ready for it. The next morning, I made my move. I printed flyers and slipped them into mailboxes around the neighborhood, polite, professional-looking notices inviting residents to a community discussion about HOA leadership and practices. No mention of Karen's name, no accusations. Just an open invitation. I also included my phone number and email for anyone who wanted to share their experiences privately. Within hours, my phone lit up. Stories poured in. People fined for flowers planted without approval, harassed for parking work trucks in their own driveways, even cited for hanging holiday lights too early. I compiled it all into a single, thick folder. Karen must have caught wind of it because by mid-afternoon, I got another violation notice, this one claiming my fence was 2 inches too high. I almost laughed. It was like watching a cornered animal bare its teeth. That night, sitting on my porch, I saw her step outside. Our eyes met across the street, and for the first time, I smiled at her. Not the forced smile I'd worn before, but a real one, The kind that says, "I know something you Dan single quotes," because now I wasn't just reacting. I was hunting. The night of the community discussion felt like a storm was brewing. You could feel it in the air. Neighbors walking a little faster than usual, glancing over their shoulders, whispering in small circles on their lawns. I'd reserved the small meeting room at the local library, a neutral spot away from HOA. Property so Karen couldn't shut it down. By 6:45, 15 minutes before the start, people were already filing in. By the time the clock hit 7, the room was packed, folding chairs scraping the tile, murmurs bouncing off the walls. I had a stack of copies of the HOA bylaws on the table, along with the folder of complaints I'd been building. My plan was simple: get the truth out in the open, let people see they weren't alone, and then propose a vote to remove her as president. If we could get enough signatures to trigger a special election, Karen would be forced to fight for her position, this time in the light. Not from the shadows. Just as I was about to start, the door opened and in walked Karen. Her heels clicked. Like a metronome against the floor, her smile wide but tight. She was wearing a bright red blazer, the kind of outfit meant to project power. Behind her were 2 board members, Lambert, of course, and a woman I barely knew. They took seats in the front row like they owned the place. "Well," Karen said, her voice sugary, "I'm glad you all came. I see our newest resident is very passionate about community involvement." She glanced at me, her eyes glittering. "I only wish he'd come to me directly instead of organizing whatever this is." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. I took a breath and stood. "This isn't about me," I said, making my voice as steady as I could. "This is about how this HOA is being run. I've spoken to over 20 of you in the past week, and the stories are the same. Unfair fines, harassment, intimidation. It has to stop." I held up the folder and let it drop onto the table with a satisfying thud. Karen laughed lightly, but there was a tightness around her mouth. Harassment. That's a strong word. I simply enforced the rules everyone agreed. 2, when they moved in. "That would be true," I said, "if you enforce them fairly. But you don't." I opened the folder and started reading aloud the miller's find for an approved paint color. Derek's harassment lawsuit, the bogus violations people had been hit with for things as petty as kids' toys in the yard. Every example made the room a little quieter, the tension a little sharper. Then Mrs. Alvarez, an older woman in the back, stood up. "Last Christmas, she fined me $500 for having a nativity scene. Said it was excessive outdoor decor." Her voice shook, but she didn't look away from Karen. "I've lived here 30 years. That's never been a problem before." One by one, people started speaking up, their voices gaining strength as they realized they weren't alone. I watched Karen's expression shift from amused to irritated to something darker. She was losing control of the room, and she knew it. Finally, I took out the petition I'd prepared. "If you believe the HOA should have leadership that serves the community instead of punishing it, sign here. We need a special election to choose new leadership we can trust." Karen shot to her feet. "This meeting is unofficial and unauthorized. Anything signed here is meaningless." I smiled. "Actually, according to Section 8, Article 3 of the bylaws, any gathering of HOA members with a majority present can petition for a special election. We have over half the neighborhood here right now." I gestured to the crowd, "so it's very much official." That's when her mask cracked. "You think you can just waltz in here and take what's mine?" she snapped. "I built this neighborhood. I've kept it from turning into a dump." Her voice rose, shrill, and the board members beside her shifted uncomfortably. Lambert avoided her gaze completely. "You didn't build it," Derek said from the back. "You've been draining it?" The room murmured in agreement. I set the petition on the table. One by one, people came up to sign. Karen stood there, her face pale, except for the 2 angry red spots on her cheeks. When Lambert finally stepped forward and signed his name, I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen before: panic. She turned to leave, but stopped in the doorway. "You have no idea who you're messing with," she said, her voice low and cold. "I'll bury you before I let this happen." Then she was gone, the click of her heels fading down the hall. By the time the meeting ended, we had more than enough signatures. A special election was now locked in. The vote would be in 30 days, and until then, Karen would still be president, which meant she had 30 days to unleash whatever hell she could muster. Walking to my truck, the rental I was using until my Silverado came back, I knew the fight had just gone from quiet resistance to a loud war. But I also knew something else. For the first time, Karen wasn't the only one with an army. The first attack came less than 48 hours after the meeting. Mrs. Alvarez, a sweet old woman with a nativity scene, called me in tears. Someone had slashed both of her front tires in the middle of the night. "I know it was her," she whispered. "No one else has ever bothered me until I spoke up." My gut twisted. Karen wasn't even trying to be subtle anymore. She was sending a message by the end of the week. 3 more people who had signed the petition got sudden violation notices in the mail. Derek was cited for improper fence maintenance, even though his fence was brand new. The McKays were told their garden posed a pest hazard because they grew tomatoes. Rachel's husband, Mark, got a $500 fine for excessive driveway oil stains that didn't even exist. It was like watching a wildfire spread. Every time someone fought back, she doubled down. One night, Rachel came over looking pale. "She cornered me in the parking lot at the store," she said, her voice shaking. "Said if you don't withdraw the petition, she'll make sure you regret ever moving here." I felt my jaw tighten. She was going after my family now. That wasn't just HOA politics, that was personal war. I started documenting everything. Every fine, every complaint, every late-night coincidence that happened to petition signers. I bought a couple of small security cameras and helped my neighbors set them up too. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I'd make sure she had nowhere to hide. But she was just getting started. 2 weeks before the election, I came home to find a bright orange notice: a foreclosure risk taped to my front door. My heart skipped. I knew I wasn't behind on my mortgage, but when I read the fine print, my blood ran cold. It was a notice from the HOA claiming I owed $3,250 in unpaid fines, the ones she'd been piling on since day one. If I didn't pay within 30 days, they could legally place a lien on my property and start foreclosure proceedings. I called the HOA office immediately. A bored-sounding woman answered, and when I gave my name, there was a pause before she said, "You'll need to speak with the president about your account." My voice went ice cold. "Tell her I'll see her in court before she sees a dime." That night, my phone rang. No caller ID. I almost didn't answer, but something in my gut told me to pick up. Karen's voice came through the line, low and smug. "You think you've got the neighborhood on your side, but they'll fold when they realize it's their wallet or you. I can make this all go away, just withdraw the petition." "Not a chance," I said. She sighed, like I was a stubborn child. "Then I'll make sure you're out before the election. 30 days is a long time, and you're just one man." She hung up before I could reply. For the first time since this all started, I felt a flicker of doubt. She had resources, connections, and no moral lines. I had a group of angry neighbors and a growing pile of evidence. But evidence doesn't stop a liar from spreading poison. The next morning proved that point. Overnight, someone had plastered the neighborhood with flyers claiming I had a criminal record for assault, that I'd been fired from 3 jobs for violent behavior, and that I'd moved here after being evicted from my last home. All lies, but the kind of lies that stuck in people's minds once they heard them. My phone buzzed nonstop with texts from neighbors asking if it was true. Rachel was furious. "We need to fight back now, not after the vote," she said. "You've got enough to go to the county housing board and maybe even the police." She was right, but part of me wanted to wait to let her get so reckless she'd leave no way to wriggle out. That afternoon, I got an unexpected ally. Lambert, the same board member who'd signed the petition at the meeting, showed up at my door. He looked tired, nervous. "She's going too far," he said. "She told me if I didn't back her up, she'd leak something about my wife. I'm done. Whatever you need, I'll help." He handed me a folder full of internal HOA emails, and in them, the smoking gun I'd been praying for. Karen had instructed board members to target specific residents with violations and fines, especially those disrupting harmony in the neighborhood. Her coded way of saying anyone who opposed her. She even mentioned my name directly, telling them to push until he cracks. With that, I finally had undeniable proof of her abuse of power. Now it wasn't just her word against mine. Now it was her own words hanging her. I called Derek and the Millers that night, told them what I had, and we agreed we'd make this public at the election meeting. Not just to vote her out, but to make sure she could never hold another position of authority again. The only problem? Still had 2 weeks to survive before that meeting. And if Karen realized I had this kind of evidence, I knew she wouldn't just go after my truck or my wallet. She'd go for my life as I knew it. And judging by the black SUV idling outside my house later that night, engine running with its lights off, she might have already started. The HOA office was buzzing the next morning, but not in the usual way. I could tell something had shifted. Karen's Range Rover sat in the visitor's lot instead of her private HOA space, a thin film of dust already settling on it. Word was spreading that she'd been stripped of her enforcement privileges until the board could review her conduct. That meant she couldn't issue citations, couldn't fine people, and most importantly, couldn't touch me. But I knew her. Karen wasn't the type to lick her wounds quietly. If anything, this would push her into something reckless, something personal. By mid-morning, I got the first hint of her next move. My neighbor, Jenna, came over looking pale. "She's going after your sister," she whispered, glancing around. As if Karen could hear her through the walls. I froze. My sister Emily lived 2 streets over, in one of the cheaper houses near the property line. She'd kept her head down, never gotten involved in HOA disputes. The fact that Karen was dragging her into this, it was a direct message. Karen had found my soft spot. Emily called not long after, her voice trembling. She came by saying my flower beds are a violation. Said she could fine me $200 a day until I fix them. I don't even have flowers, just grass. Emily was a single mom, barely making ends meet, and the stress in her tone made my chest ache. I drove over, trying to keep my anger in check, but when I pulled up and saw Karen's smug face across the street, watching us like a predator, I knew I was done playing defense. She wanted a war. I'd make sure she got one she couldn't walk away from. But it wasn't going to be loud or sloppy. No screaming matches in the street. No satisfying scenes she could twist into her victim narrative. I'd take her apart the way she'd tried to take apart so many people here through the rules she worshipped and the connections she thought she owned. The first step was information. People talk when they're tired of being pushed around, and Karen had made enemies out of half the neighborhood. By evening, I'd compiled a list of past complaints against her real ones, filed by residents and quietly buried by her allies. On the board, the stories were ugly: trespassing, harassment, even intimidation of elderly homeowners. One man claimed she'd entered his property without permission and thrown away his holiday decorations. Another had photos of her moving his trash cans to the middle of the road and calling the police to report obstruction. I knew these accounts alone wouldn't be enough. The HOA board liked to protect its own unless they were forced to act. So I went one step further. I filed a formal petition to have her removed entirely, attaching every statement, every date, every witness I could get. And I didn't just send it to the board, I copied the local news outlet and our county commissioner. When Karen saw me in the grocery store 2 days later, her composure cracked. "You think you can take me down?" she hissed, leaning in close, enough that her perfume choked the air between us. "This neighborhood needs me." I looked her straight in the eye. "No, Karen, this neighborhood needs to be free of you." The petition started circulating online, and the response was overwhelming. People were finally emboldened to share their stories, some going back years. It wasn't just me or Emily anymore, it was a chorus of voices she'd silenced with intimidation. And the more she tried to defend herself, the more defensive and unhinged she appeared. But I wasn't satisfied yet. Her car still sat there every day, shiny and arrogant, as if it was untouchable. And that gave me an idea not to damage it, not to sink to her level, but to turn it into the perfect symbol of her downfall. With help from a few residents, I tracked down the actual ownership records of the HOA lot she was parking in. Turns out it wasn't communal property, belonged to a business owner just outside the development. One polite phone call later, had permission to act. The tow truck arrived at 10 a.m. sharp, its engine rumbling like the prelude to justice. Karen came running down the walkway in her robe, screaming about lawsuits and theft. But the driver just handed her a copy of the property map and pointed to the signature of the lot's owner authorizing the removal. Her voice cracked as the Range Rover's front wheels lifted off the ground. "You can't do this to me." "Oh, Karen," I said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear over the hydraulics. "That's where you're wrong." She stood there, barefoot on the asphalt, watching her status symbol disappear down the road. For the first time since this war began, she looked small. Not angry, not dangerous, just small. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't beaten yet, and part of me feared she had one last, desperate move, left, one that could undo everything if I wasn't careful. The air was heavy that morning, the kind of heavy that sits on your chest before a storm breaks. I woke up early, earlier than usual, my mind buzzing with everything that had happened. Karen had been quiet since her screaming fit the night before, but I knew her type silence didn't mean surrender. It meant plotting. My coffee sat untouched on the counter as I stared out the window at her house across the street. Her driveway was empty. That was my first warning. The second came 10 minutes later when my phone lit up with a message from my neighbor. "Mark, bro, she's calling. In some guy with a flatbed truck. Looks like she's trying to mess with your property." I didn't even put shoes on before running outside. Sure enough, a strange man in a work vest was backing his truck toward my driveway. Karen stood beside him, smug as a cat that just swallowed a bird. "He's trespassing," I called out, my voice sharp. The guy paused, glancing at Karen for confirmation, but her arms were crossed like she owned the whole neighborhood. HOA Rule 14 says no unregistered vehicles. His truck is parked illegally, she declared loud enough for the other neighbors to hear. I stepped closer, my eyes narrowing. "It's registered, insured, and parked on my land," I shot back. "You don't get to decide that." But here's where she underestimated me. Over the past week, I'd been gathering every scrap of evidence, every HOA violation she'd committed, and every recording of her harassment. I had documents, pictures, and even witness statements from half the neighborhood. And now, she'd just tried to authorize towing from private property without legal grounds, a serious offense. I pulled out my phone and started recording. "State your name," I told the driver. He hesitated, muttered it, and I made sure. It was loud enough for the mic to catch. Then I turned to Karen. "And you're confirming you told him to remove my vehicle from my private driveway?" She smirked. "Absolutely. And when it's gone, maybe you'll learn not to break the rules." I ended the recording, slipped my phone in my pocket. I smiled, not a friendly smile, but the kind that says, "You just dug your own grave." I told the driver calmly, "If you touch my truck, you'll be charged with trespassing and theft, Karen." Here will be added to the report as the instigator. He looked between us, clearly uncomfortable. Karen huffed, "Do it, I'll handle him." But the man wasn't an idiot. He got back in his truck, muttering something about not worth the trouble, and drove off. Karen's smirk faltered. I didn't waste another second. I called the police, and when the officers arrived, I showed them the recording, the HOA's own bylaws, and the evidence of her repeated harassment. They took statements, but I wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. That afternoon, I called my attorney, who had been patiently waiting for the moment Karen crossed a legal line. We filed a restraining order, a harassment complaint, and a formal demand for damages both for the vandalism to my car and her attempts at unlawful towing. Within a week, things moved fast. The restraining order was approved, meaning Karen couldn't come within 100 feet of me or my property. The HOA board, already tired of the trouble she caused, was forced to hold an emergency meeting. And here's the twist to remember all those violations I'd been documenting. Turns out, her precious rose bushes extended 2 feet into the public sidewalk zone. Her backyard shed wasn't up to code, and she'd been keeping an unregistered vehicle in her garage for years. The board had no choice but to fine her heavily. The day the notice was delivered, I stood on my porch, sipping coffee, watching her pace in her driveway as she read it. Her face turned red, then pale. She glanced at me, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't shout. She just looked. Defeated, that night, her car was gone from the driveway. The rumor from Mark was that she'd gone to stay with her sister, until things blew over. But things didn't blow over. 3 months later, her house went up for sale. The combination of legal fees, HOA fines, of the fact that half the neighborhood now refused to speak to her had driven her out. The night the sold sign went up, I walked down the driveway and touched the hood of my new, unscathed truck. There was no satisfaction in her suffering, only relief that the storm had finally passed. Still, as I stood there under the quiet streetlights, I thought about everything she'd done and everything she'd lost. Some people destroy themselves without even realizing it. Karen's war had started over a petty grudge and a smashed car. But in the end, she'd been the one towed away from the life she thought she controlled. And me? I got my peace back. My driveway was safe, my truck untouched, and my home once again mine. But I'd learned something important. When someone tries to take your dignity, your safety, or your peace, you don't have to yell or stoop to their level. You just have to be patient, prepared, and ready to act when the moment comes. Karen never came back. But the memory of that same hour when I towed her car will always remind me justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the sound of a truck rolling away, carrying someone else's arrogance right off your property.